Okay, and we are live. It is December 24th, 2024, Christmas Eve. Welcome to another episode of Days with Davo. First of all, let me start off by saying happy holidays from your favorite podcast, Days with Davo. It's almost Christmas time. Um, actually, wait. Okay, now it's Christmas time. Those of you who are just listening and not watching the content, what I did, I stepped on a pedal and I turned on the lit up garland. So we're ready. It's Christmas. All right. First things first. I got my Jesus mug. We're ready to go. Um, when I started this podcast, I talked about how I wanted to get into some weird news plus some conspiracy stuff. We're going to do that today. So first things first, let's start with some weird news. What could possibly be going on recently that's kind of weird, kind of off, kind of can't really put your finger on it. Don't know what it is. Oh, that's right, orbs and drones. Orbs and drones. They're up in the sky. They're over where I live, and you know, states adjacent to us. So it's kind of weird, kind of scary. But the more you really think about it, what are you going to do? Whatever's going to happen is going to happen. So live your life. It's not going to change the way you celebrate Christmas, is it? Nope, not me. Anyway, um, so I have a few theories on what the orbs and drones are, and we're going to kind of go over them. But I actually would love if you guys would either comment on whichever way you're checking out this podcast, or if you just want to hit me with a direct message, you want to comment on any of the social medias, feel free. I'd love to hear your theories because I've got a few. Number one, this one's a little woo-woo, a little out there, but Sumerian gods coming back has to do with like fallen angels, stuff like that. And if you're not into like the whole fallen angel things and you really never kind of looked into it whatsoever, so years and years ago, way before our time, there were a group of angels. You know, if you believe in that, I do. I totally believe in angels, but there were fallen angels that it's not a clever name. They kind of like fell from the heavens and came down to earth, and they were like kind of like banished. And what they did, they ended up mating with a lot of like the earth women and created a race of what they call Nephilim. And some say that the Nephilim were giants, and some of the giants possibly created the pyramids, and they did a bunch of stuff. If you go into like old world sort of conspiracy theories, if you look at some of the buildings that have been around for like a really long time, all of the archways are huge. And the reason why they say that is because giants and Nephilim had to walk through them. And obviously, if they were regular size, you can't walk through them. That's one theory. Another theory is obviously everyone's saying aliens. It's aliens that come down and they've had enough, and they're at the final season of Earth, Earth 2024, season 2024, and they're coming down. But if it is aliens, what are they here to do? Just kind of blink us to get to death? Because that's just what they're doing. They're up there just blinking, 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 trying to make us go crazy. So we fight with each other and then eventually just destroy ourselves that way. Maybe, hey, possibly. But if I really get into what I think all of this is, it goes back to General Wesley Clark and his address where he talked about 7 countries in 6 years. And one of those 7 countries was Iran. And that seems to be the only country we haven't occupied in any sort of way. So is this possibly getting into the 7th country? So if we throw up all these drones and all these weird orbs and stuff like that, and we say, oh, obviously it's Iran. I've seen it. I've seen a bunch of people like comment, like post stuff on Facebook saying, looks like Iran, must be Iran. I don't think it is. I think it's us. And so if we're thinking that it is Iran and we're under attack, and so we have the full backing the government for our military to go in there and start some sort of skirmish. So that's what I think. But I would love to know what you guys think. So hit me up. Let me know. I'd love to hear it. All right. So today we are going to get into something I've been working on. Ooh, God, has to be for months. So I read this book by Dave McGowan called Weird Scenes in the Canyon. It's all about the government's infiltration of the hippie movement and the Laurel Canyon kind of like hippie scene where like a lot of like it was all originating. And so basically I read this book about a year ago and I wanted to do a podcast on it because it is like conspiracy, it's true crime. For the ladies out there that love your true crime, really gets your engine running, you're going to love this because there's some true crime in there. So stay tuned. And then there's a bunch of weird stuff that went on. But I really wanted to do this one. But I read the book like a year ago, and I didn't really remember everything, so I had to reread the book. And with my limited time and what I can really like, I don't know, square away and like kind of like work on like podcast stuff, it took a while to reread it, and I took a ton of notes. I mean, I literally had 20 to 30, maybe even 40 pages of notes. And so I had to like shrink it down or else we'd be here till New Year's talking about how every one of these big names in the hippie scene with music, all of their parents have some sort of military intelligence ties. It's absolutely crazy. The book was written by Dave McGowan, and he kind of links it all together. And just like a little heads up, Dave McGowan, like he was never a real big conspiracy theorist, a little bit, but more or less what he was into was serial killers and how he felt that serial killers were not something that just sort of happened, but were made. And his daughter started talking about this sort of stuff, and they were on vacation or something, and he kind of looked into it a little bit, and he got real sort of like peeled back the layers of the onion, and the more and more he peeled back, he found out like more stuff. So then he wrote this book, and as he will say, and as I will say too, that when you do write about this sort of stuff or talk about this sort of stuff, you kind of get attacked by people. And I have a few instances, and he had mentioned that, especially from like people that love the Doors or love Frank Zappa, like they push back big time on it. And I myself, every once in a while, I'll like if I see like a photo of like Jim Morrison, I'll go in the comments and I'll post something, and all I'll say is read this book, and people will like almost like yell at me, like really get back at me and be like, oh, you don't know what you're talking about, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, listen, dude, all I said is read the book. Like it's, open your mind up a little bit. Maybe you change your thought. But there was one guy that said that he said some stuff to me, and then I came back and was like, listen, dude, I don't mean anything by it. And he goes, oh, music is my religion. You have to understand this. And I was like, well, don't use that word because like you just lost the argument there, but who knows? All right, so we're going to start off. All this takes place in Laurel Canyon in the Hollywood Hills. Laurel Canyon, 1913, founded by Charles Spencer Mann and his associates. Started off as Laurel Canyon Boulevard and Lookout Mountain, Lookout Inn. What was that all about? They created like sort of almost kind of like a getaway area. Had a ballroom, riding stables, tennis courts, golf course, a massive tavern / roadhouse, which becomes a log cabin later on. The inn lasted about 10 years and then suddenly engulfed in flames. And you will be surprised as we get into this how many things just sort of poof, light on fire. Happens. Apparently happens there. So they had that place for a while, like in the 20s, and then right around 1941, Lookout Mountain gets built, and originally air defense system, 2.5 secluded acres surrounded by an electric fence. By 1947, featured a fully operational movie studio, processing labs, editing facility, animation department. 17 climate-controlled film vaults, helicopter pad, and bomb shelter. Made more than 19,000 classified films, also run by the Air Force. First 3D was said to be made there. Actors included Jimmy Stewart, Ronald Reagan, Bing Crosby, Walt Disney, Marilyn Monroe. They were all given clearance for undisclosed projects. Facility maintained as many as 250 producers and directors, text editors, and animators. Military base operated in the hippie epicenter. Known Canyonites that were in the film industry were James Dean, dies young and mysteriously. Natalie Wood, same. Marlon Brando, James Coburn, Dennis Hopper. There is a excuse me. There is a Devil Without a Cause. It's a movie, but they have a Devil Without a Cause curse, and it's all kind of linked to Dennis Hopper. Basically, he was the only one that didn't perish from that. So then we kind of get into the Young Turks. There was like a group of actors that were all around the Laurel Canyon scene, and they were sort of like in like all the movies, and they were sort of just like they kind of mingled in and out of the hippie culture, and they were just like all around all the time. Bruce Dern, his grandfather, was Secretary of War, now known as Secretary of Defense. Why would you ever change that? His mom was a sister of the Minister of Propaganda who served under FDR and a member of Skull and Bones 1 year before Prescott Bush. If you don't know who Prescott Bush is, he is the father of George Herbert Bush and grandfather of George W. Bush. And it's also said the Skull and Bones stuff is kind of cool because all that took place in Yale, and Yale is from where I live. It's not too far. It's I could drive there if I wanted to. I know there's another podcaster that gives tours, and he's like really into the New Haven kind of conspiracy thing. But Yale has like a bunch of like weird stuff. Anytime I see someone that comes out of Yale and they end up being president, or they're like let's say Bill Clinton, Yale, Hillary Clinton, Yale. Even most recently, J.D. Vance, Yale. I kind of give him the side eye. What's really going on there? Because Skull and Bones is absolutely crazy. So, Prescott Bush, back to what I was saying earlier, he is pretty well known for, while he was in Skull and Bones, they dug up the grave of Geronimo and took the skull and did all sorts of weird Skull and Bones shit with it. I think they would use it sacrilegiously and drink from it, stuff like that. And it got to a point where I guess they Skull and Bones has actually given it back to the family of Geronimo, and they actually have it. But for the longest time, it was like in property of like Yale. Okay, now Henry Fonda, dad, part of the Naval Intelligence, mom, a direct descendant of Henry the Dennis Hopper. Dad was a member of the OSS, and if we know anything about the OSS, it was a precursor to the CIA. Although his cover was a Methodist minister, pretty good cover. Also had female associates. They were called like the Turkettes, I guess, young Turkettes. That's kind of dumb, but whatever. I didn't name them. Jane Fonda, Sharon Tate, who we will kind of get into a little bit, daughter of Naval Intelligence, Sharon Tate, and Nancy Sinatra, daughter of Frank Sinatra, and I don't think we really need to go into everything Frank Sinatra was connected to. I mean, like mob shit on top of mob shit on top of mob shit, like all like the big names that had to do with our government getting in bed with mob back in the 40s, right, or in World War II. Like Frank Sinatra was in with all those dudes. See, so now I'll go back to Sharon Tate for a minute. You will hear her name come up probably a few different times during this. Anyone doesn't know about the 150 Cello Drive? That's where the Charlie Manson murders happened. Like where kind of like the nail in the coffin to the end of the hippie revolution. And this podcast will dive into a bunch of stuff with Charlie Manson, because basically the way that they played out Charlie Manson was he was just this whack job cult leader that just picked these people sporadically, and that's not the way it happened. Like, Charlie Manson was like in on the scene. He was going to all these parties. He was dealing all these people drugs. Like, they knew him. They recorded his music. It was like absolutely really crazy. But if you get into, and I'll comment on another book, it's a book called Chaos, which is written by Tom O'Neill, and where he did a anniversary of the Charlie Manson murders. He didn't really want to, and he got into them, and just like pulling back the layer of the onion, the more he pulled back, the more he found out, like the whole Helter Skelter thing by Vincent Bugliosi, that book. And he actually tried the whole Manson family. It was all like, there was a bunch of like hidden, kind of like hidden truth throughout the whole thing. And so that's a good one. If you ever get a chance to read Chaos, it's absolutely amazing. But so yeah, Sharon Tate will come up, Charlie Manson will come up, like all these different things. So keep in the back of your mind, 1,000, or was it 150, 10050, Cello Drive in Laurel Canyon. Warren Beatty, dad was a psychologist in D.C. area and was known to be the father of MK Ultra. You all know what MK Ultra is. It's a mind control that our government has been using for years. They say that they don't do it anymore, but I don't believe it. Jack Nicholson, very weird. His whole story is very weird. He was one of the Young Turks, raised by grandparents. Mom got pregnant at a super young age. She was kind of like a showgirl. Was told she was his sister. Didn't find out she was his mom until after her death. And when she was 45 years old, when she died, he found out when he was 37, a decade later after she died, is told he was born at St. Vincent's in New York. But the weird thing about that is that birth certificate when he was born never existed. Like, didn't have one. So he has a birth certificate that link him to his grandparents, but not an actual like first birth certificate. So it's kind of like the dude doesn't exist. It's very, very weird. Now we'll kind of get into Rustic Canyon. Rustic Canyon is, I guess you could call it Laurel Canyon, but it's more like adjacent to Laurel Canyon. It's where Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys lived. Tex Watson also lived there. Tex Watson is one of the guys that committed the Charlie Manson murders at Cello Drive. Dennis was recording Manson at his brother Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys studio. Neil Young was very impressed. Dennis said he didn't know much about the murders. Then he changed his tune and said he would write a book about it at some point in his life. But he drowned in 1983, so he did not get a chance to write that book. Weird, huh? And the way that Dennis Wilson died, he drowned. A lot of people say he was drunk and he dove in the water. But I don't know. There's a lot of speculation around that. You know, he was a beach boy. Like, he knew how to swim. Like, he didn't drown. Jim Morrison, lead singer of The Doors. If you don't know who Jim Morrison is, check him out. Some of the Doors music, I always found really cool. So a little precursor to this whole thing. People like, hey, Dave, you grew up in the 90s. How do you know like a lot about like the 60s and the hippie revolution? Well, my parents had an extensive record collection. And when I was young, I stole all of their vinyls. I didn't steal them, like I took them and I listened to them in my room. But so I kind of grew up on like a lot of this music and I really, really liked it. So I don't know. I guess you could say I was kind of like a hippie at heart growing up, but I did love grunge too. So there's A little bit there. Okay, so Jim Morrison, lead singer of the Doors, father was in charge of the false flag that got us into the Vietnam War called the Gulf of Tonkin. Never had an interest in music or even picked up an instrument. Well, one of the guys that would yell at me on the internet about Jim Morrison and how he was a poet and I should die. Um, there is a picture of Jim Morrison photographed with his dad like 3 months before he hit the music scene. And if you watch the Doors movie, Val Kilmer, very good job. Oliver Stone film, it's a very good movie. But Jim Morrison said that his parents were dead. He never like acknowledged that his parents were still alive. And then there was a lady that was like a journalist that found out that his parents were alive, and she was like, "Why'd you lie to me?" Yada yada yada. But he always said that they were dead and that they weren't alive, in which they were alive. And so, like when people push back, they're like, "Oh, that's why he distanced himself from his parents because he didn't believe with what his dad was doing." But I mean, it was like 3 months before he hit the music scene. Like he like was hanging out with his dad, like photographed in front of a giant table ship. So I don't believe it. He never had an interest in music or even picked up an instrument. He wrote all the Doors songs before he joined the band. So he's writing all these songs without an instrument, without anyone helping him out. He just has all these songs in his head. Like I call BS on that. Like I just don't believe it. Iconic hairstyle was done by Jay Sebring, who was also at Cello Drive during the Sharon Tate murders. Even the Doors producer said that they weren't good live, exciting theatrically, but lacked music talent. Important to know that Morrison's kindergarten classmate at Annapolis was this woman named Gail Sloatman, and Gail is known to be an assistant at the Whiskey A Go Go, who was run by Elmer Hart, notorious gangster. But it's also important to know that she married Frank Zappa. So, is it possible that Jim Morrison and Gail go to kindergarten together on a Navy base? Both their dads have something to do with military intelligence. Yes. Is it possible that she still marries Frank Zappa? Yes. But it's very coincidental that they all live in the same area in Laurel Canyon. That's where I kind of get kind of weird about it. All right. The Birds didn't own any instrument, gifted from a woman who funded government projects. Studio musicians played all their songs, called the Wrecking Crew. Oh, excuse me. David Crosby became the biggest star, and he mainly added like backing vocals. First album, almost the whole thing was cover songs. Like 5 were Bob Dylan songs. They didn't need to be good. The media had their back. Live shows were bad, but the dancing troupe named the Freaks came to all the shows and became the show. So like the Freaks were led by this guy named Vito Pelucas. And what they would do, they would go on the Sunset Strip, and where any of these bands were playing, they would come front and center, and it was a bunch of them dancing. Now, Freaks was not a clever name. They would do like these freaky dances, and they would gyrate all over the place. And so people weren't exactly like watching the band, weren't actually like really into the music. Yeah, the music was in the background, but the main show was the Freaks down on the floor, and they were looking at these freaks, and that was drawing a lot of the attention away. Now we go to Terry Melcher. Once again, Terry Melcher, his name comes up with the Sharon Tate Manson murders. He produced the Birds. Mom was Doris Day. Dad used to hit his mom, but died of a suicide when he was 3. Doris marries a man named Marty Melcher, who, surprise, surprise, hits Doris a bunch and adopts Terry, and actually embezzles like $20 million from her. Terry Melcher has the biggest ties to Laurel Canyon. Whenever like all these bands kind of like intermingle, it's always Terry Melcher knew this guy or Terry Melcher knew that guy. He was sort of like the glue that holds it all together. Goes to school with the head of the Freaks, the guy named Vito Palukis. While in school, also befriends Bruce Johnstone, Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys. Dennis and Terry dubbed themselves the Golden Penetrators. Ew. Terry lived in where the Sharon Tate murders happened, 150 Cello Drive, with then girlfriend Candice Bergen. And if you grew up in the 80s and 90s, you remember Candice Bergen played Murphy Brown. Then leads to Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate. Dennis Wilson said while Manson and his crew lived with him, they used to party at Cello Drive all the time. Buffalo Springfield, Young and Palmer used to be Neil Young and I believe Bruce Palmer. They used to be with a band called the Mina Birds, who their lead singer was Super Freak Rick James. But Rick James had to go away to military prison because he was supposed to be in the military and he went AWOL and didn't think he'd get caught, but they always catch you. Buffalo Springfield was like the first super group made of Neil Young, Stephen Stills, Richard Furay, and Bruce Palmer. They have like a serendipitous meeting on the Sunset Strip, and this is where I kind of like push back on like a lot of the stuff. So while Neil Young and Bruce Palmer were up in Canada, they decide after Rick James gets caught for going AWOL, they decide to head to California. They just have this itch. They have to go to California. It happens, you know. So they, I think they like drove a hearse down, like an old hearse. So they drive this hearse and they go down to California. And meanwhile, Stephen Stills and Richard Furay are living there too, and they kind of have this weird hunch that that something's gonna happen, some big thing's gonna happen, and they're gonna pop off, right? So they're down on the Sunset Strip. They're in like deadlock traffic, and they're going one way, and then you have Neil Young and Bruce Palmer going another way, and I've never been to the Sunset Strip, but I have been in traffic before, and something happened as they were driving where they kind of cross paths, and Stephen Stills is quoted for saying, "Oh, I wouldn't believe it if I didn't see it myself, but that is Neil Young." And then they turn their big van around in the middle of Sunset Strip traffic, and then they met up, and then next thing they know, they're like, "Let's get together and make a super group." Yeah, no, seriously, that's their story. That's how they say it happened. Once again, I don't believe it. So then, on April 11th, 5 days after that meeting, they start playing shows, which continues from April and wraps up around June. Then signed to a new record company called Atlantic. Now, Atlantic Records, founded by Ahmet. I can't pronounce that last name. It's something very Turkish. Ahmet, son of a diplomat to the League of Nations and Turkish ambassador, which brings young Ahmet to DC. Ahmet attends private schools with sons and daughters of congressmen and intelligence operatives. Ahmet starts by signing jazz musicians, and after his father dies, he starts signing these rock bands. He signs Clapton, he signs Zeppelin, and the Stones. Excuse me. Also located in DC was Capitol Records. So there's two major labels signing the first two major Canyon bands, both based in DC. Kind of weird, right? Coincidental that that's where our government is, and that's where these two big record companies are. Well, just saying, United States is a big place. Why DC? So like when it came to this time, it was Vietnam. There was a war. Guys were getting drafted left and right. So between draft and like legal troubles, like none of these guys in the canyon ever saw any of it. There was a giant bust that involved Buffalo Springfield, Eric Clapton, and a dozen others, all detained for a few hours, then walked away scot-free. Papa John Phillips, huge pharmaceutical drug bust, should have seen 45 years, did 30 days, and a country club prison. David Crosby said the DEA could have popped him for interstate drug trafficking anytime they wanted, but never did. And there was always sort of like a hands-off approach by the LAPD. All these guys were in the ripe age for the draft, and none of them ever got drafted. Their excuse was every time that they would go in front of the draft board, they would say they had medical conditions or they were gay, so they wouldn't draft them. But I don't know. They were like plucking all these young men to go over and fight in Vietnam, but the guys in Laurel Canyon didn't. I don't know, it's very weird. Stephen Stills' father was military intelligence, spent many years in Central America growing up. Military school in St. Petersburg, Florida, relocated in 1961 to Costa Rica, made his way to Greenwich, New York to meet Peter Tork and the Monkees. Tork left New York for Connecticut to work for Pratt & Whitney for a little bit, defense contractor. And then to Venezuela, because, you know, that's what you do. You go to Connecticut and you're like, Venezuela seems nice. Why don't I go there? You know. Stills tried out for the Monkees, but lost the audition to Tork because of thinning hair and bad teeth. Sucks to be you, Stephen. All right, now we're going to hop over to Graham Parsons. This one I dove into kind of the most. There were a couple of them, like Graham Parsons and Frank Zappa. I kind of like went in the most. But like I said, I have like 40 some odd pages of notes. I didn't put all of it in here. This is sort of just like a drive through, like, hey, this stuff was going on in the 60s. The government was in charge of it. You should really look into it. Read the book. It's called Weird Scenes in the Canyon by Dave McGowan. If you don't have it, shoot me a message. I'll let you borrow mine. It's good. Okay, so Graham Parsons, long line of royal bloodlines. Mom Avis, heir to the fruit empire. Dad's name was Coondog Ingram. I don't think his real name was Coondog, but we're going to use it because it's funny to me. Parents rumored to be swingers. Coondog takes his own life with 38 caliber. Mom Avis takes Graham and his sister, little Avis, on a trip. Now Avis Sr. meets Bob Parsons. Bob Parsons is a gentleman who, what he did for a job, he sold heavy machinery to Cuba and other South American countries. Maternal side of the family does not like Bob. They think he's kind of shady. Bob adopts both kids and changes the birth certificates to show Bob as the biological father, because that's weird. Convinces Avis Sr. to sue her brothers and sisters for majority control of the fruit empire. Years later, Bob and Avis welcome another child, and along with that child, 18-year-old babysitter, which Bob has an open affair with. Bob's employment, like I told you, selling heavy machinery to Cuba and places like Venezuela, Brazil. Bob gets caught up in the Cuban crisis, very close ties to the exile group in Florida to overthrow the Cuban government. On one occasion, Bob takes a young Graham Parsons to the training facility for the exile group. Just happens to be Time magazine there, and they snap a photo of a young Graham Parsons with a bunch of Cuban exiles. And it's going to go on the cover of Time magazine, but Mom Avis makes sure that that picture never sees the light of day. And to this day, that picture has never seen the light of day. Years later, Bob opens a club where Graham can play keyboards and sing. Starts a band with Brandon DeWild, Richie Fiore, and John Phillips. John Phillips, Papa John from Mamas and the Papas, and Richie Fiore, I believe, was in Buffalo Springfield, maybe, or the Birds. I don't remember. The group would meet up in Laurel Canyon years later. At this point, Graham is interested in either Annapolis or West Point, but decides on Harvard. And the way he gets into Harvard, because his grades are really mediocre, but apparently he wrote like a award-winning essay, and everyone at Harvard were like, "Let's get this guy in here. He must be a genius. He wrote an essay." I don't think he even wrote it. During his graduation from high school, he's pulled aside and has news of his mom passing away from alcohol-related illness. And those close to him that were around there said he really showed no emotion whatsoever. She died of alcohol poisoning. Bob smuggled her in a bottle of hooch to seal the deal. She was 42 years old. Dad, biological dad, Coon Doug, was 41. Graham starts Harvard in September 65. A few months later, he quits. Wasn't for him. Graham hits the folk music scene in Boston, legendary Club 47, where Joan Baez played often. Joan's father, CIA Connect. If you get a chance, do a deep dive into Joan Baez's father. A lot of it is kind of weird, where he was something to do with like Cornell University, where he did some sort of mind control there. Super interesting. Graham ends up playing in the Birds briefly, and then the Flying Burrito Brothers. Thrown out for substance abuse. Graham meets a woman named Gretchen and marries, and Bob throws the wedding for him. Graham and Gretchen move to Laurel Canyon. Graham has a few different deaths that kind of like are close to him that affect him all around in the same time. Like, I mean, within like months apart. And then his house burns down. Like I said, Laurel Canyon. Houses are burning down all the time. So after that, Gretchen and Graham move into Gretchen's dad's house in Laurel Canyon, different part of Laurel Canyon, but they don't stay long because Graham dies suspiciously at a young age of 26. So basically, here's the way the story goes. So Graham was in Joshua Tree, and he was there with his assistant. Assistant's name was Michael Martin. And so Michael Martin and his girlfriend and one of Graham's high school sweethearts were all hanging out there. Now, Graham previously used to go up to Joshua Tree quite a bit. He would take a bunch of acid, and then he would bring people like Keith Richards and like other like famous musicians, and they would look for UFOs. That was just the thing. So this time he's there with those four people, the two girls and his assistant. The assistant's job is to make sure that Graham doesn't go overboard with his drugs or alcohol or what have you. So they're partying a little bit, doing some drugs, not a whole bunch, just small little kind of like weed, probably acid, stuff like that. So they run out of weed. And supposedly Michael Martin heads off back to LA to go get some more weed. So it's just Graham and the two girls. Then suddenly Graham ODs somehow. But it was pretty well known that he was not doing any hard drugs, but somehow ODs. So Graham ODs, and the two girls and like the head of the inn at Joshua Tree, they all have like conflicting stories. The cops question the girls a little bit and then let them go. Nothing major. Now Michael Martin, his assistant, never comes back. He just I guess forgot to come back, got some weed, and just decided, oh well, I'm not coming back. And it's not like the days of cell phones. Like you're not texting someone and be like, hey, something happened, don't come back here. Like the dude had no idea. And so he never comes back, and then they take his body. They do a toxicology report on it. They find that he did have like some hard drugs in his system, but not recently in the system. So like they're in his kidneys. They know that he had like chronic substance abuse trouble, but he didn't OD. He like it's very weird. It's very weird the way he died. So they put him in a coffin, and then they a cop brings him to LAX. So now his manager, a guy named Phil Kaufman, and his assistant, these two drugged up hippies driving an old dilapidated hearse, go to pick up the body. The cop doesn't see any problem with it. I mean, these guys are like out of their mind, drunk and stoned, and he even helps them load the body into this dilapidated hearse. I mean, the hearse had broken windows and like was falling apart, but cop didn't see anything wrong with it. I'm like, oh, that's fine, sure. Take this rock legend with you. So then they load him up, and instead of bringing him to like a funeral parlor to like or like a place to bury him, they bring him back to Joshua Tree and burn him and the casket, and that's it. Like that's the end. So then Phil Kaufman, a little while later, gets arrested for. I guess you can't just like burn a body. It's not legal. So they arrest Phil Kaufman and they let him off with like a $300 fine and the price of the casket, and everything's said and done. So meanwhile, Bob Parsons is trying to get control of Graham's estate, and he dies randomly too. It's like everyone all died around the same time. It's very peculiar. So that's the story of Graham Parsons. He was like an up and comer. He was supposed to be like the next big thing, and he amounted to nothing and died at 26. Very sad. Okay, now the monster, John Phillips and the Mamas and the Papas. John is born to Claude and then Edna Phillips. John's mom, her claim to fame was she was kidnapped by gypsies when she was 1 year old, and they found her in Mexico like months later. Claude meets Edna when she's 15 and starts a relationship. Gross. By 18, she gives birth to her first child, Rosie, who spends her career as an employee at the Pentagon. So John Phillips' sister, career employee at the Pentagon. In the late 20s, Claude is commissioned to Haiti, Nicaragua, before coming back to Virginia. Catholic and military schools for a young Papa John Phillips. Had an appointment for Annapolis, but dropped out. Chose to work on a fishing boat with, this is the weirdest group that I think a up-and-coming hippie / musician could work with. A retired naval officer and 3 retired Army generals, all working on the same fishing boat. Well, kind of weird, right? I'm sure it happens, but I don't know. It's just weird to me. John's first wife, direct descendant of John Adams, in 1957, spent time in war-torn Cuba, because that's where you go to vacation, right? Cuba. He and his companions whisked off the street at some point and were brought on a variety show in Cuba. Cool, right? 1958, back to LA for Mr. John Phillips, where he meets a woman named Michelle Gilliam. Michelle was 16 when she started dating John, 25. Ew. 1962, John finds himself in Cuba alongside Naval Station Mayport during the Cuban Missile Crisis. 2 months later, Michelle and John marry and meet Denny Doherty and Cass Elliott, otherwise known as Mama Cass. The quartet embarked on a Caribbean vacation playing clubs along the way. They returned to the USA, LA to be specific. John and Michelle buy a house up Lookout Mountain. During the mid to late 60s, the Phillips and Mama Cass were the epicenter of drug-filled parties, including all of the Canyon nights. So, like, basically, especially Mama Cass's house, she had kind of like an open door policy where hippies would just like come in and out, and there was always drugs, always jam sessions, always like a bunch of stuff going on, including, you guessed it, Charlie Manson. 1970, John and Michelle split up, include at least one event of domestic abuse. It was so bad to this day, Michelle will not talk about it, just says he put her in the hospital, and that's all she's going to say about that. They had a child, China Phillips, part of Wilson Phillips from the 90s. John marries again with a couple more kids. Mid 70s, John heads across the pond to put out a solo record with the Stones' help. Around the same time, Mama Cass heads that way too, but unfortunately, she had a one-way ticket. She never makes it back. She met her fate in Harry Nilsson's flat in London. Now, the lore about Mama Cass is because, I guess, because she was overweight. They said that the way she died is she choked on a ham sandwich. Not true. Um, Doing a little bit of a deep dive with Mama Cass, she actually um, was like dating like a lot of different like mob guys, gangsters, and like a bunch of like other stuff like that. She was kind of like in the dark part of the Lower Canyon, and I feel like she knew too much, and so she had to go. Personally, that's just what I think. The other two members, Denny lived a pretty normal life after Mamas and the Papas ended. Canadian variety show host, a couple of them. Michelle tried a solo career, but that went nowhere. Ended up having a pretty successful acting career, most notably as the mom of Steve Sanders in 90210. Okay. Excuse me. John Phillips had a huge drug bust in the 80s. I had mentioned his drug bust where he served only like 30 days. So basically, it was like all pharmaceuticals. And his daughter, Bijou Phillips, and she actually is an actress herself. And most notably, the wife of Danny Masterson before he went to jail for being a complete and utter disgusting human being. And they're not married anymore. But yeah, she had mentioned that they always wondered how he must have had like some sort of connection where he was getting all these pharmaceuticals from the pharmacy itself. And she said that he actually bought the pharmacy and that's how he was getting all the drugs. Crazy, right? Okay, so John Phillips, he ends up dying of heart failure in, I believe, 2007. Now, meanwhile, one of his other daughters, Mackenzie Phillips, who had her own trouble with substance abuse, writes a tell-all book showing how much of a monster John Phillips actually was. I'm not really going to dive in, get real graphic with it, but he was very incestuous. And I believe on the eve of her wedding, he forced himself on her. Gross. And she got pregnant at one point, and she had no idea if it was her husband's or her father's. Double gross. And that lasted for like, I guess, like a decade. Like really, really gross. Like when I said dude was a monster, he's a flipping monster. All right, let's move on to the man, myth, the legend, Mr. Frank Zappa. His father, named Francesco from Italy, moved to DC, part of undisclosed military intelligence establishment involved in chemical warfare division at Edgewood, also home to Human Mind Control Division after World War II. The Zappas moved to Florida in the 40s for some unknown reason, returned to Baltimore in 1951. Francesco offered a job in Utah, but decided to head to Monterey to teach at Naval Postgraduate School. Moved again in the mid-50s to San Diego, home of the world's largest naval fleet. There, Francesco would be part of the Atlas program, the first intercontinental ballistic missile. He would work on putting warheads on said missile, but reports are murky because his work was classified. 1956, they move again to Lancaster, California. Late 1950s, Frank moves into his own apartment, mingles with other soon-to-be Canyonites from the same background. By 1960, Frank meets another Canyonite from the association named Terry Kirkman, who introduces him to Paul Bluff. Paul Bluff is an interesting character. Paul Bluff recorded all the beginning mother of invention stuff, and he had his own recording studio. Paul Bluff also studied aviation um, with the Marines, where he graduated top 500 of his class, then works at General Dynamics, where he engineered parts for guided missiles. He eventually leaves that job to, wait for it, record hippies. Opens his own recording studio. 1963, Zappa gets Herb Cohen as a manager, along with other Canyonites. Linda Ronstadt, Alice Cooper, who was like a protege of Frank Zappa, Lenny Bruce, comedian, and Tim Buckley. Cohen returned to LA after conveniently being in the Congo around the same time the CIA sponsored coup that toppled and led to the execution of a legally elected prime minister. Because, democracy. Cohen also spends some time in Copenhagen as an arms dealer, and then becomes a manager for hippies. 1966, Zappa creates Mothers of Invention and is known as a dictator when it comes to recording. 1967, Zappa marries, I talked about this earlier, Gail Slopeman, kindergarten chum to Mr. Jim Morrison. Worked as an assistant for Elmer Valentine, well-known gangster who runs Whiskey A Go Go. A month later, welcomes their first child, Moon Unit Zappa. That's right, Moon Unit. It's important that I tell you the rest of the Zappa children's name. Ahmet, named after the Atlantic Records CEO. Who else was there? There's Dweezil Zappa and Rodan Zappa. And my favorite, Diva Thin Muffin Pigeon Zappa. Hey. I guess Susie and Bob were taken. All right. The Zappas then moved to the log cabin, notoriously known around the canyon. Bunch of different vaults for rooms in secret underground tunnels. In the late 1960s, the Zappas moved out of the log cabin to a more secluded house in the canyon. And the reason for that was there was a crazy gun-wielding guy that came to the log cabin, called himself the Raven. Now, there's also another guy around the same time that was going around that same moniker, and his name was Jim Jones, who was the head of a cult. And if you really don't know who Jim Jones is, you should look into Jonestown. It is Banana Land. Okay. Where was I? The log cabin then sold to Eric Burden of the Animals, who refused to work with Zappa because of his authoritarian approach to recording, quoted as saying it was like recording with Hitler. Some notable things with the Zappas after the 60s. 1985, Frank Zappa testifies in front of Congress against Tipper Gore for labeling purposes on records. Like, remember the parental guidance adjusted little label? Yeah. He pushed against that, but it didn't work because they did it anyway. Becomes a figurehead for the World Bank, because hippies, that's what they do. Dies of prostate cancer in 1993, is buried in an unmarked grave a day before it's released that he died. So, no one knew he died until the day after, and they're like, oh, is there going to be a service? No, we had the service yesterday. He's buried. You don't know where he is. The end. All right. Notable occurrences. Ahmet Zappa was with Rose McGowan, known to grow up in the Children of God pedophilic cult, who also had the Phoenix children, Joaquin and River. If you remember River Phoenix, he died at the Viper Room. Technically, they said he OD'd, but no one's really sure how he OD'd. They didn't really see how it happened. So, and the Viper Room, foot of Laurel Canyon. Rose McGowan then dates Brian Warner, who is the fourth cousin of presidential hopeful Pat Buchanan. Brian Warner also goes by the name Marilyn Manson. as the two figureheads that he idolized, Marilyn Monroe and Charlie Manson. So it all kind of like always comes back in a circle. It all comes back to Manson somehow. So that's about it. And like I said, guys, this is a drive-through. This is not everything. There's a lot more people. There's some stuff, and this one I found like super interesting. Being a big Grateful Dead fan, one of the roadies for the Grateful Dead, named Owsley Stanley, was if you look at the Grateful Dead bear, like technically that's Owsley. They that little logo is him. That dude made all the acid for Laurel Canyon. I think he made all the acid for America during the 60s. And he also was one of the ones who made, he constructed like the Wall of Sound. If you ever look at like some of like the Grateful Dead shows, they used to play in front of this thing called the Wall of Sound. It's not a clever name. It's like a shit ton of speakers, like all behind him. And you always kind of wonder, like, how do these hippies know how to do all this stuff? Like, how do they know how to make acid? How do they know how to do this? Because they were trained by the government. Owsley has like a crazy military intelligence past. I didn't really go into it just because, we're already at, we're almost at like an hour. This is maybe my longest podcast so far. So congratulations. If you're still with me, you made it. I want to thank all of you guys. It's been a great year. This is the first year for the podcast. And I want to thank everyone who has subscribed, who follows me, who, like there's certain people out there that are always commenting on my stuff, like all the stuff I post on my podcast page on Facebook or Instagram or whatever. Like, I got nothing but love for you guys. I appreciate you so much. You made it a great year, and next year is going to be even better. So stay with me. It's going to be fun. We're going to get into so many more weird things. So I want everyone to have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And it wouldn't be me if I didn't like end on something to do with the season. So it being Christmas, let's end off with something about Christmas. One of my favorite movies, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. It's important to know what the takeaway from Rudolph is. And the takeaway from Rudolph is people are only nice to you until they need something from you. Have a good one. Merry Christmas, guys. Peace.